church history, theology, and a class that was interestingly titled ministry, as if ordained clergy were the only ones doing that specific work in the church. The professor who had charge of our foundational ministry class said something profound on that first day. He suggested to us eager seminarians that if there was one thing and only one thing we accomplished in our 3 years of study at the Divinity School, it should be this: develop a working theology about death and dying. Develop a working theology about death and dying. I was 22 years old at the time, and this charge struck me on several different levels. One level was, I hope, authentic curiosity, which was quickly verbalized when I raised my hand in youthful enthusiasm and asked that question which every teacher longs to hear. Why? Why would that charge be given right out of the starting gate on the first day of a 3-year course of study designed to form, nurture, and in some cases indoctrinate zealous theologues into ordained ministers of the gospel? His response was gentle, but equally convicting. You need to develop a working theology about death and dying, because 90% of the work you do in your vocation as an ordained priest will center around issues of death and dying. 90%. Really? I wondered to myself, 90% of my work is death-related? I could not get my head or my heart wrapped around that concept. But the teacher had issued this charge with such an insistent clarity that I and others in the class took him at his word, spending much of our seminary careers forming a working theology about death. Almost 30 years later, I'm still awestruck by the accuracy of his knowledge, his experience, and his sage advice. And I'm still awestruck by how much of my spiritual, theological foundation about death and dying still informs me almost every single day. In the midst of life, we are in death, says one of the familiar anthems at the beginning of our prayer book burial office. Indeed, death is all around us. It is very much a daily reality. In our experiences of life, loved ones die, and things we love die. Pets and plants die. Relationships die. Dreams die. And opportunities die. In the larger experience of the world around us, death is also found in many forms. Familiar institutions close their doors. My high school, for example, Elyria West, is no more. The building is still there, but it is no longer a school. Recently, however, the old high school in Lorraine was closed, and that building was torn down. It really is no more. We've closed 12 churches in the Episcopal Diocese of Ohio in the last 26 years. And the Roman Catholic Diocese of Cleveland, Toledo, and Youngstown have closed more than that in the last 5 years. In the midst of life, we are in death. Images of death confront us every day, and our living memory is full. The Twin Towers fell 10 years ago on 9/11, and death is reflected in the change of the New York City skyline. Natural disasters such as Hurricane Katrina wiped out entire neighborhoods with over 1,800 lives lost. Just a little over a year ago, an earthquake struck off the coast of Japan United States have made revered communities, entire cities, and more lives disappear. Just yesterday, 3 members of a Columbus-based Ohio National Guard unit were killed following an attack by a suicide bomber in northern Afghanistan. And last night, Kathy and Stephen Plank's daughter Erica's father-in-law, Rick Hagan, died suddenly. In the midst of life, we are in death. During Lent, Mary Louise Van Dyke and I were meeting as part of our Unbinding Your Soul book study, and she shared with me that Dr. Georgia Newman had made a recent trip out to Kendall, where in her no-nonsense, direct way, she instructed residents there to prepare for the end of life and get their houses in order by filling out living wills and durable powers of attorney. In the midst of life, we are in death. Of course, this conversation reminded me that not long after I came to Christ Church, we organized a spiritual formation series entitled Preparing for Life After Life. The effort was to gently coerce us to confront our own deaths by making plans and provisions for those left behind. The series covered everything from knowing where our important papers are to writing wills and planning our own funerals. I not only accomplished this work for myself, but also worked through the details with my parents, for which we were so very grateful when my father died last September. And when someone from our parish family dies, one of the first things I do is go into my office and look in my family files to see if they have left any funeral instructions. If you haven't already done so, preparing for life after life is a spiritually healthy way of acknowledging that in the midst of life, we are in death. And there's a shelf in our parish library which contains many, many resources to help accomplish this spiritual work. In the Christian calendar, today is the day above all other days to confront death. Though it remains difficult for many people, even devout Christians, to do so. At student lunch this past week, Mia Young, a member of the Oberlin class of 14, suggested that she would be willing to head up the charge, the committee, to bring back Palm Sunday the way it used to be in the old days, before the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. In those ancient times, Palm Sunday really was the beginning of a much more observed Holy Week. But the framers of the new prayer book had scads of evidence telling them